Imagine attending what should be the happiest day of a man's life, a wedding full of laughter, clinking glasses, and heartfelt vows. But behind the smiles, a dark plan simmers, unseen by anyone. The groom, charming and calculating, harbors a secret so shocking it could destroy lives in a single night. As the wedding feast begins, guests start to feel strange, their laughter twisting into coughs and groans. Panic spreads, chaos erupts, and in the midst of horror, the groom slips away, not with his bride, but with someone no one expected, the bridesmaid, whose own secrets might be darker than his. What drives a man to betray everything he promised? And what unseen forces guide the fateful night's grim events? Next, we will unravel the first chapter, exploring the calm before the storm and the subtle clues no one noticed. Disclaimer: this story is purely fictional, crafted for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or events is coincidental. Chapter 1. The calm before the chaos. Welcome back. The day had started like any other spring morning in the sleepy English countryside, where birds sang over dew-soaked gardens and the village clock tower chimed lazily. The manor, a sprawling estate surrounded by ivy and wisteria, was alive with quiet excitement. Carriages rattled along the cobblestone drive, delivering elegantly dressed guests to what everyone believed would be a perfect wedding. The air was sweet with the scent of roses, the laughter of children playing in the courtyard, and the soft hum of servants preparing the feast. Inside the grand hall, tables were laid with fine china, crystal goblets, and gleaming silverware. Candles flickered in ornate candelabras, casting shadows that danced along the walls. The groom, Henry Mallory, was a man everyone admired, handsome, confident, and seemingly devoted to his bride, Eleanor. But beneath that polished exterior, a calculating mind plotted a plan no one could foresee. Henry moved through the hall, smiling and shaking hands, his charm unbroken, yet in his pocket lay a small, unassuming vial, its contents dark and potent, a secret that would turn celebration into calamity. Meanwhile, the bridesmaid, Lillian, watched Henry from across the room. Her smile was warm, her eyes attentive, but there was a flicker of something else, a knowing look, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Some whispered that she and Henry shared a connection beyond casual acquaintance, though no one dared speak it aloud. The chatter, the clinking of glasses, the soft strains of a string quartet. None suspected that the night would descend into terror, nor that the bonds of loyalty, love, and trust would shatter in minutes. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying an ominous chill. A black raven perched atop the manor gates, observing silently. Guests laughed at the sight, unaware that such minor omens had historically foreshadowed disaster in tales of old. Servants moved briskly, arranging platters of delicacies, while Henry's gaze lingered on Lillian, a subtle signal exchanged, a silent understanding between two conspirators amidst the facade of marital bliss. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the hall, Henry raised his glass for a toast. Laughter followed, but a faint unease rippled through the room, subtle yet undeniable. Guests shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, oblivious to the impending horror lurking in the very cup they were about to raise. Next, we discover the first signs of illness spreading among the guests and the subtle moves Henry makes to manipulate the unfolding chaos. Secrets long hidden begin to surface, and the line between celebration and catastrophe blurs. Chapter 2. A toast turned deadly. The manor hall, once filled with laughter and clinking glasses, began to shift under an invisible weight. It started subtly. Mrs. Cartwright, an elderly guest known for her sharp tongue and keenness, coughed once, then twice, her eyes widening as an unexpected dizziness overcame her. Across the room, young Mr. Peters, who had been admiring the floral centerpiece, swayed, gripping the edge of the table for support. A faint ripple of concern ran through the guests, but no one yet suspected the darkness creeping into their midst. Henry observed from across the hall, his movements deliberate, composed. He raised his glass again, smiling with practiced charm, but inside he noted every reaction, the stifled coughs, the subtle pallor creeping across faces. Lillian, by his side, mirrored his calm demeanor, though her hand brushed his ever so slightly, a silent reassurance between co-conspirators. Together, they moved like shadows within the bright hall, blending in as panic silently threaded its way through the gathering. Servants began noticing the first signs. Plates trembled in shaky hands, the scent of unease replacing the earlier aroma of roasted lamb and delicate pastries. A faint murmuring started, soft at first, then louder as more guests felt the strange onset of nausea and dizziness. The string quartet faltered, the music warbling as the violinist's fingers shook uncontrollably. Henry's eyes scanned the room, calculating, anticipating each reaction like a chess master predicting every possible move. Some guests whispered of food poisoning, glancing nervously at the elaborate feast. Yet others began to suspect something more sinister, a shared calamity beyond chance or coincidence. The manor itself seemed to echo their confusion. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the walls, and a cold draught slipped through the hall as if the house itself were watching, waiting. In the midst of mounting panic, Henry guided Lillian subtly toward a side corridor, a passage known only to a few servants. Their steps were silent, measured, as chaos engulfed the main hall. Through the open doors, he glimpsed guests collapsing, their cries rising in a horrific chorus. Each falling figure marked another move in the grim symphony he had orchestrated. Lillian's eyes met his, a fleeting moment of complicity, and together they vanished from sight, leaving confusion, fear, and the scent of betrayal in their wake. Outside, the evening sky darkened, clouds rolling in as if reflecting the turmoil within. The laughter and chatter that had once filled the manor were replaced with coughs, groans, and frantic exclamations. Panic took hold, and a once celebratory night became a scene of terror and uncertainty. Next, we discover how the guests' fear escalates into chaos, the true extent of Henry's poison begins to reveal itself, and the manor's darkest secrets emerge, secrets that will change the night forever. Chapter 3. Panic in the Grand Hall. The manor hall, once a symbol of celebration, had transformed into a scene of escalating terror. Guests stumbled, clutching their stomachs, faces pale and contorted with pain. Mrs. Cartwright's coughing had turned into a harsh wheeze. Young Mr. Peters collapsed entirely, his crystal glass shattering across the polished floor. The string quartet abandoned their instruments, leaving the room filled only with gasps, groans, and the soft shuffle of trembling feet. Panic spread faster than anyone could comprehend. Servants ran in frantic circles, offering water and calling for help, but the chaos was overwhelming. Silver platters tipped over, spilling untouched delicacies as some guests tried desperately to reach the doors. The chandeliers above cast flickering shadows that seemed almost alive, stretching along the walls in grotesque shapes, amplifying the sense of dread. In a corner, a group of older women clutched one another, whispering prayers, while tears streaked down their faces. Henry watched from the shadows near the corridor entrance, his calmness chilling in contrast to the bedlam. Each reaction, each stumble, was exactly as he had anticipated. Beside him, Lillian's hand briefly touched his arm, a subtle confirmation. They were in control of a night that had unraveled into chaos, orchestrated with precision. Their plan was unfolding perfectly. While guests panicked and succumbed to the poison coursing through their veins, they could slip away unnoticed, free from the bonds of expectation. Yet as they moved toward the outer passage, a faint, unsettling sound caught their attention. A low moan, barely audible over the cries in the hall. One of the younger guests, a keen-eyed man, had started to follow the corridor, sensing something amiss. Henry's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated nearly everything, but unpredictability had begun to creep into his perfect scheme. A fleeting moment of tension gripped him, just enough to remind him that even the most meticulous plans could unravel under the smallest misstep. Outside, the evening wind howled through the estate's ivy-covered walls. The manor gates creaked ominously, echoing through the darkening grounds. Some of the surviving guests had begun to flee, stumbling into the gardens, their pallid faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight that had been left behind in the hall. Yet the poison was relentless, and one by one, those who thought to escape were overtaken by nausea, dizziness, and despair. Inside, Henry and Lillian paused at the top of the side staircase. From this vantage, they could see the full extent of the horror. The once celebratory gathering was now a tableau of human suffering, a grim testament to the danger that lurked behind smiles, speeches, and the trappings of a perfect wedding. And yet, beneath the terror, an even darker twist waited, a revelation that would forever bind Henry and Lillian to the night's macabre events. Next, we discover the guests' desperate attempts to survive the unfolding nightmare, the shocking confrontations that arise in the hall, and the first hints of the sinister pact between Henry and Lillian that no one could have foreseen. Chapter 4. The Sinister Pact Revealed. By now the grand hall had descended fully into chaos. Guests moaned and staggered, clutching their stomachs as the poison coursed through their veins. Candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that twisted along the walls, while silverware clattered across tables, echoing like ominous chimes. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood from minor cuts and the pungent aroma of upturned dishes. Panic had stripped the hall of its elegance. The laughter and music that had defined the celebration now felt like a distant memory. Henry and Lillian paused near the ornate double doors leading to the east wing. Here, the groom's calm mask finally slipped into something darker, something calculated and almost predatory. In the faint candlelight, Lillian's eyes reflected a mixture of fear and exhilaration. For weeks, whispers in hushed corridors had hinted at their plan. But now, standing amid the pandemonium, the truth of their pact was undeniable. Henry had orchestrated every detail, the timing of the poisoned dishes, the placement of the vial, even the subtle gestures to mislead servants and guests alike. And Lillian had aided him, her knowledge of the manor's hidden passages proving invaluable. Together, they were a team bound by secrecy, ambition, and something far more dangerous than affection. In the hall, guests began noticing strange patterns. Plates untouched by the poison were bypassed, while those who indulged first were collapsing fastest. Whispers of suspicion and fear spread like wildfire. Some guests began to suspect deliberate intent, their eyes darting toward Henry, who maintained a facade of innocence, raising a trembling hand in feigned concern. Others, weaker and disoriented, could barely comprehend the orchestrated horror around them. Outside the east wing, Henry and Lillian slipped through the servant, its corridor, moving quickly but cautiously. Their silence was absolute, yet a sense of urgency permeated their movements. Every footstep echoed in the deserted hallways, as if the manor itself were aware of their intentions. Lillian glanced over her shoulder, ensuring no one had discovered the secret path. Henry's gaze remained fixed ahead, the thrill of control mingling with a simmering tension. What if something unforeseen threatened to undo their meticulous design? Meanwhile, in the hall, a group of guests tried to rally, attempting to assist those who had fallen. But the poison left them helpless, collapsing one by one. The air was punctuated with gasps, cries, and the soft shuffle of frightened feet. The orchestra had fled entirely, their music abandoned in the face of human suffering. The night, meant to commemorate love, had twisted into a tableau of fear, betrayal, and death. Next, we discover how Henry and Lillian's escape plan faces its first obstacles. The hall descends further into madness, and the terrifying truth of their alliance begins to come to light for those who survive. Chapter 5. The Flight Through Shadows. The night outside the manor was dark and restless, winds lashing through the ancient oaks that lined the driveway. Inside, Henry and Lillian had emerged from the hidden corridor into the east wing, a part of the estate few guests had ever seen. Dust motes hung in the dim light, and the smell of aged wood mixed with the faint metallic tang of spilled wine and panic. Every shadow seemed to watch them, and every creak of the floorboards echoed their racing hearts. Henry's hand brushed lightly against Lillian's as they moved swiftly, silently, through the labyrinthine halls. Each step had to be measured, one misstep, and they risked being seen. Behind them, the hall had become a scene of utter chaos. Guests, some barely conscious, stumbled and fell as servants shouted over the din, desperately attempting to regain control. Henry's meticulous planning had accounted for every detail, almost every detail. In the grand ballroom, the aftermath was horrifying. Candles had toppled onto silk tablecloths, some igniting small flames. The poisoned guests were scattered across the marble floors, some vomiting, others clutching at each other in confusion and fear. Screams echoed, bouncing off the high ceilings and ornate walls. Amid it all, the realization began to dawn on a few survivors. This was no accident. Someone among them had orchestrated this horror with intent. Meanwhile, Henry led Lillian through a side stairwell, their footsteps barely audible. The walls were lined with old paintings whose eyes seemed to follow them, a silent testimony to the manor's history and the secrets it had witnessed. Lillian's breath came in shallow, steadying intervals, her mind both exhilarated and terrified. This was the culmination of months of planning, whispered conspiracies, and stolen moments of complicity. Together they had crafted a night no one would forget, but at what cost? As they approached a rear exit leading to the gardens, the sounds of chaos inside grew distant, yet more haunting. Guests continued to collapse, some still attempting to escape the hall, only to succumb to the poison. The wind carried shouts and groans across the estate, blending with the distant tolling of the village clock. Henry paused, listening carefully. Every sound, every reaction had been accounted for, but the unpredictable element remained: human instinct. One wrong glance, one sudden movement, and their freedom could vanish in an instant. Lillian grasped Henry's arm, a silent question in her gaze. He nodded, understanding perfectly. Nothing could be left to chance. The final stretch of their escape would be dangerous, a race against both time and human observation. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipating what would happen next. Next, we discover the first major obstacle in Henry and Lillian's escape, the manor's vigilant groundskeeper, and witness how close their freedom comes to unraveling in a heartbeat.
Chapter 6. The Groundskeeper's Suspicion. The moon hung low over the manor gardens, casting long, shifting shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. Henry and Lillian moved swiftly, their footsteps muffled by the soft grass, yet each snap of a twig beneath a shoe sent a shiver of tension through them. Freedom felt tantalizingly close, yet danger lurked in the form of an unexpected obstacle. The groundskeeper, Mr. Whitaker, a man whose loyalty to the estate was matched only by his keen intuition. Whitaker had noticed unusual activity earlier in the evening. A shadow slipping through the east wing corridor, a whisper here, a door left ajar there, small details that had seemed insignificant at first, now forming a troubling pattern in his mind. As he patrolled the perimeter, he caught a flicker of movement near the garden hedge. Squinting into the darkness, he saw two figures darting across the lawn, Henry and Lillian. Henry's heart raced, but his calm mask remained in place. Every calculated step now mattered more than ever. Lillian clutched his arm lightly, signaling silent communication. Stay focused. Remain invisible. They pressed themselves into the shadow of a large yew, barely daring to breathe as Whitaker's lantern beam swept perilously close. For a tense moment it seemed as if the entire night had been reduced to that single heartbeat. Whitaker muttered to himself, suspicion sharpening in his eyes. Something about the scene inside the manor had unnerved him, the sudden collapse of guests, the chaos in the grand hall, but he couldn't yet piece it together. As he moved onward, Henry and Lillian crept toward the rear gate, using every obstacle, the hedges, the statues, the darkened corners of the gardens, to conceal their flight. The garden itself became a silent accomplice, the twisted shadows of ancient trees providing cover. Yet each step forward carried the risk of discovery. Lillian's breaths were shallow, measured, her pulse quickening as the manor behind them erupted in muffled cries of terror. She could feel the thrill of their audacious plan mingled with the fear that even a single misstep could spell disaster. Suddenly a cat startled, hissing as it darted across their path. Whitaker's head snapped in that direction, lantern swinging. Henry froze, calculating instantly. The cat's path would buy them mere seconds, but seconds were precious. With a swift, silent motion, he grabbed Lillian's hand, pulling her into the deeper shadows as Whitaker's lantern passed by, narrowly missing them. A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant groans and coughs echoing from the manor hall. As they reached the wrought iron gate at the edge of the estate, Henry paused. Beyond it lay the freedom they craved, but also the unknown. One misjudged move, one flash of recognition, and their night of cunning would collapse entirely. Next, we discover how Henry and Lillian make their desperate escape beyond the estate grounds, the dark roads of the countryside stretching ahead, and the first hints of their plan's long-term consequences begin to emerge. Chapter 7. Into the dark countryside. Beyond the manor gates, the night opened like a velvet abyss. The winding country lanes stretched endlessly, shrouded in darkness, with only the faint glow of the moon illuminating the uneven cobblestones. Henry and Lillian moved swiftly, their breaths visible in the cool night air. The distant sounds of the manor, the groans, the shouts, the chaos they had left behind, were fading, yet the weight of what they had done pressed heavily upon them. Henry led the way, confident and calculating, but each step reminded him that the countryside was unpredictable. Narrow bridges spanned streams, rickety fences lined the edges of the roads, and the wind carried an eerie whistle through the trees. Every shadow seemed alive, threatening to reveal them. Lillian's hand gripped his tightly, a silent acknowledgement of both fear and complicity. They were partners in a night of betrayal that would mark them forever. As they turned a sharp bend, the distant flicker of a lantern caught their attention. A solitary traveler, perhaps a night walker returning home, had spotted movement on the road. Henry's instincts kicked in. Ducking behind an overgrown hedge, they held their breath, hearts hammering. The traveler passed, oblivious to the fleeing couple, leaving them to continue their precarious flight. Even in the open countryside, danger lingered. Every clatter of a loose shutter, every hoot of an owl, felt like a warning. The air was thick with tension, and yet a grim exhilaration ran through Henry. This was the culmination of months of meticulous planning, the orchestrated chaos at the manor, the silent corridors, the poisoned guests, and now, the final act, escape into a freedom that came at an unbearable cost. Lillian spoke quietly, her voice almost lost in the night. "Do you think they'll figure it out?" she asked, glancing back toward the manor. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, yet a flicker of guilt crossed her features. Henry's reply was steady, cold. "By the time anyone pieces it together, we'll be long gone." But even the best-laid plans have cracks. The countryside, unfamiliar in its shadows, tested them. A fallen tree forced them to detour, the narrow lane twisting unpredictably. In the distance, a barking dog startled them, and for a moment, Lillian's composure faltered. Henry's hand pressed lightly to her back, urging silence, while every muscle in his body remained alert. Their night of cunning was far from over, and every misstep could unravel everything. As the hours stretched on, the manor became a distant memory, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the countryside. The wind carried whispers through the trees, and the moonlight highlighted their path in an almost spectral glow. Yet beneath the thrill of escape, the first shadows of consequence began to emerge. A life once filled with certainty now teetered on the edge of ruin and revelation. Next, we discover the first hints that their freedom may be short-lived, the trails left behind that could expose their crime, and the growing tension between Henry and Lillian as the reality of their actions begins to weigh on them. Chapter 8. Shadows of Pursuit. The countryside was silent, but not empty. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch, seemed magnified in the darkness. Henry and Lillian pressed on, their figures swallowed by the moonless night. The manor with its chaos and horror was behind them, yet the weight of their deeds followed like a phantom. Each step forward was measured, cautious, as if the night itself were testing their nerve. Henry led the way along a narrow dirt path, flanked by dense hedgerows. He was confident, but even the most meticulous plans could falter in the unpredictable terrain of the open countryside. Lillian stayed close, her eyes darting between shadows, alert for any sign of pursuit. They had assumed the manor's chaos would delay anyone, yet the possibility of discovery gnawed at the edges of their resolve. A faint sound carried through the trees, a distant horse's hoof, slow and steady. Henry's hand pressed to Lillian's back, signaling silence. The sound grew louder, closer. A village constable, alerted by the screams and rumors, was patrolling the roads, seeking signs of disturbance. Henry's pulse quickened, but he remained outwardly composed, blending into the shadows like a wraith. Lillian's grip tightened, and for the first time that night, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Had they underestimated the consequences of their actions? The night air grew colder, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a distant chimney. It should have been comforting, a sign of human life nearby, yet in the tension of escape it became ominous. Every sound, every movement demanded attention. The distant barking of dogs, the snapping of twigs under unseen feet, these were not just environmental noises, they were warnings. As they approached a small, overgrown bridge spanning a shallow creek, Lillian stumbled slightly, her shoe catching on exposed roots. Henry caught her arm, steadying her, his eyes scanning the darkness for any observer. The incident was minor, but it underscored the fragility of their freedom. One slip, one careless glance, and the night's careful orchestration could crumble. Despite the tension, there was a strange exhilaration between them. The adrenaline of escape, the thrill of secrecy, and the audacity of their plan had created a bond beyond explanation. Yet, in the quiet moments, Lillian sensed the first cracks forming, not just in their surroundings, but in their alliance. Shadows of doubt and guilt whispered beneath the surface, subtle yet persistent, threatening to disrupt the fragile harmony they had maintained all night. Beyond the bridge, the path opened into a faintly lit village road. Freedom seemed almost tangible, yet the sense of being hunted remained. Someone somewhere would notice the devastation at the manor, someone would follow the trail, and the longer they fled, the tighter the invisible grip of consequence began to close around them. Next, we discover how the first real confrontation with pursuers unfolds, and the tension between Henry and Lillian escalates as they realize their plan may not go as smoothly as they believed.
Did you know, in real European history, poison was not just a dramatic plot device, it was a feared weapon of murder and escape. One of the most notorious examples occurred in 17th century Italy, where a slow-acting poison called aqua tofana became infamous. This colorless, tasteless arsenic-based poison was widely used during the Renaissance, especially in cities like Palermo, Naples, and Rome. It was sold under the guise of cosmetics or devotional oils to women who felt trapped in abusive marriages and saw no legal way out, a grim testament to how limited women's rights were at the time. Over decades, thousands of victims died after consuming just a few drops, and the poison's creators and distributors were eventually executed when authorities finally broke up their network. Poison like this was engineered to mimic natural illness, making detection difficult without modern forensic science.
Chapter 9. Close Calls and Fractured Trust. The faint glow of a distant lantern flickered against the village road ahead, revealing a figure moving with purpose. Henry and Lillian froze instinctively, pressed against the shadow of a stone wall. The quiet of the countryside had been shattered by pursuit, and now the reality of their actions, the poison, the collapsing guests, the chaos at the manor, loomed larger than ever. The adrenaline that had carried them so far now churned into unease, and each breath felt heavier. From the lantern emerged a constable, his coat catching the meager light, eyes scanning the darkness. He moved cautiously, aware of the night's potential for surprises. Henry's mind raced. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves could reveal them. He leaned closer to Lillian, whispering a plan as precise as it was desperate. "Stay behind me. Move with the shadows. Don't make a sound." Lillian's heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the strain of their shared secret. Until now, the flight had been exhilarating, almost intoxicating. But under the lantern's gaze, she glimpsed a fracture in their alliance, a momentary hesitation, a subtle misstep, and the trust they had relied upon so heavily could collapse entirely. She followed silently, every step deliberate, trying to balance fear with composure. The constable paused, ears straining, as if sensing a presence. Henry's instincts sharpened. He counted the seconds as though they were lifetimes, noting the constable's every movement. The path ahead twisted sharply, lined with hedgerows and fences. If they could reach the shadow of the next row of trees, freedom, temporary at least, might be within reach. Lillian's hand brushed against his arm, and Henry squeezed it lightly, a small gesture, but one that reminded them both that success depended not only on cunning, but on their unity. A sudden sound, A branch, sir, napping underfoot, made the constable turn abruptly. Henry froze, heart hammering. Lillian barely breathed. The constable's lantern beam swept dangerously close, casting a long, searching light across the road. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though their night of deception had ended. But then, a gust of wind scattered dry leaves, and the light shifted away. The couple melted into the darkness, using the distraction to inch forward, silent and unseen. By the time they reached the cover of the trees, their breathing was ragged, their senses hyper-aware. The danger had passed for the moment, but the encounter had revealed a stark truth. The night was far from over. Every misstep, every hesitation could lead to capture, and beneath it all an unspoken tension began to grow, an acknowledgement that their bond, forged in conspiracy, might not withstand the weight of consequence. Next, we discover the true cost of their escape as Henry and Lillian confront the first unexpected betrayal, and the darkness of their own ambition begins to threaten them from within. Chapter 10. The First Betrayal. The forest road stretched ahead like a black ribbon, moonlight piercing through the gaps in the dense canopy, illuminating patches of wet earth. Henry and Lillian moved cautiously, side by side, hearts still racing from their close encounter with the constable. For a moment, the thrill of escape had felt intoxicating, but now, a shadow of unease crept in. Every rustle in the underbrush, every distant sound of hooves or barking dogs, reminded them that danger could appear at any second. As they rounded a bend, Henry noticed movement ahead. Another figure, crouched low, partially concealed by the trees. At first he thought it was a wandering villager, unaware of the night's chaos. But then the figure stepped forward, revealing itself. It was Thomas, Henry's longtime confidant, and one of the few who had known pieces of his plan. Thomas's eyes were sharp, calculating, but also tinged with hesitation. Something about his expression made Henry's blood run cold. "Henry," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the night wind. "We need to talk. Now." His gaze shifted to Lillian, and Henry noticed a flicker of unease there, a question without words. Thomas had never been part of the flight, only the planning, but now, in this moment of peril, he seemed different. Suspicion pricked at Henry's mind. Had Thomas followed them? Or worse, had he come with his own agenda? Henry motioned for silence and stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his tone calm, though the tension coiled tight in his chest. Thomas's reply was soft but deadly serious. "I know what happened at the manor. I saw some of it, and I can't ignore it. We can't just vanish. People will find out. The authorities, they'll trace it. I won't be part of hiding this." The words struck like ice. Lillian's hand tightened on Henry's, her own eyes widening. For the first time that night, the illusion of control seemed to crack. Henry's mind raced. How much had Thomas seen? How much could he reveal? And more urgently, how could they move forward with someone whose loyalty now hung in doubt? Thomas took a step closer, and Henry instinctively blocked his path. "Listen carefully," Henry said, his voice low and deliberate. "Tonight isn't the time for hesitation. We either move forward or we fail. You follow us, or you step aside. Any interference and nothing ends well for anyone." The threat was quiet, but unmistakable. Lillian glanced between the two men, tension flickering across her face. She had trusted Henry implicitly, yet the presence of Thomas introduced a fracture into their alliance, a crack that threatened to widen into a chasm. The night, already thick with fear and adrenaline, now carried an extra weight, the uncertainty of human betrayal. Thomas hesitated, the rustling of leaves marking the seconds that stretched between them. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. Henry and Lillian pressed forward, moving into the shadowed forest once more, yet the encounter left an indelible mark. Trust, once absolute, now felt fragile, and in the darkness, a new threat loomed, not from the authorities or the poisoned guests, but from the treacherous choices of those closest to them. Next, we discover the relentless pursuit closing in, the night's tension reaching a breaking point, and how the first cracks in Henry and Lillian's alliance begin to influence their desperate flight.
Chapter 11. The Pursuit. Titans. The forest thickened around them, shadows merging with the night as Henry and Lillian pushed forward, each step careful yet desperate. Their flight had carried them far from the manor, yet the weight of consequence trailed like a relentless phantom. In the distance, faint lanterns bobbed through the trees. The constables, organized and determined, following the trail left in the chaos of the manor. Every sound of the forest, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, suddenly seemed amplified, warning them that discovery was imminent. Henry's hand brushed Lillian's arm, a subtle signal. Stay close, stay silent. Lillian's breaths were shallow, each one measured, yet the fear behind her composed exterior was unmistakable. For all their cunning, the night had begun to test them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The shadows that had offered concealment now seemed to close around them, and the countryside, once a path to freedom, felt like a labyrinth designed to ensnare the guilty. Ahead, the path narrowed between a cluster of trees, forcing them into single file. Henry led, senses alert, every instinct tuned to the faintest hint of pursuit. Behind him, Lillian's mind raced, not only with fear of capture, but with the weight of what they had done. The manor, the poisoned guests, the shattered trust of family and friends. It was impossible to outrun the consequences entirely. A sudden movement in the underbrush made Lillian gasp. Henry's hand shot out to cover her mouth as a rustling figure emerged, a deer, startled by their passage. Relief washed over them momentarily, but it was fleeting. Every minute brought them closer to detection. Every misstep, no matter how small, could unravel the night's carefully plotted escape. The constables were clever, methodical, and now close. Lantern light flickered between the trees, and Henry knew it was only a matter of time before a direct confrontation was unavoidable. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the chaos of the manor now surged in a different form. A sharp, desperate edge. Lillian, sensing his tension, leaned slightly closer, silently communicating solidarity, yet her own doubts lingered. Could their alliance survive the pressure of pursuit and fear? As they approached a narrow creek, Henry paused. Water flowed silently over mossy stones, reflecting the dim glow of the moon. A crossing here was risky, the sound could carry, revealing their position, but hesitation was not an option. Henry took a calculated step onto the first stone, testing its stability. Lillian followed, the water lapping at her boots. Each movement required absolute precision, yet with every step, the constables' lanterns drew closer, their shouts muffled but unmistakable. Beyond the creek, a faint road beckoned, a path to temporary safety, yet fraught with uncertainty. Henry and Lillian moved quickly, shadows among shadows, but the relentless pursuit ensured that the night's terror was far from over. The forest, the poison, the betrayal, it had all led to this tense, fragile moment where freedom and consequence balanced on a knife's edge. Next, we discover the first major confrontation with the pursuing constables, the night teetering on the brink of disaster, and the choices that will forever define Henry and Lillian's fates. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The faint glow of lanterns cut through the forest like knives, revealing movement ahead. Henry and Lillian froze, pressed against the rough bark of a towering oak. The constables had closed in faster than anticipated, their persistence a relentless reminder that the night's carefully orchestrated plan was hanging by a thread. Every rustle, every snap of a twig could betray their presence. Henry's mind raced, cataloguing options, escape routes, contingencies. Lillian's eyes darted nervously across the darkened path, catching each flicker of light that betrayed the approaching pursuers. The thrill of their flight had long since turned into acute tension. Now, their freedom depended entirely on a single daring gambit. The first lantern bobbed closer, revealing the figure of Constable Whitaker, whose sharp eyes had not failed him. "Stop! We know you're there!" he shouted, voice echoing through the trees. Henry's pulse quickened, but his movements remained precise. "Keep calm," he whispered to Lillian. "Follow my lead." With practiced speed, Henry darted from the shadows, grabbing Lillian's hand and pulling her along a narrow ridge beside the creek. Water splashed underfoot, chilling them to the bone, yet they pressed on, hearts hammering. A second constable appeared ahead, blocking their path, lantern raised high. There was no room for hesitation. Henry made a split-second decision. He leapt into the shallow creek, the water cold and unforgiving, dragging Lillian with him. The constables hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden, audacious move. The sound of rushing water masked their flight, allowing them to disappear briefly into the night. But the chase was far from over. The forest itself seemed to conspire, branches clawing at their clothes, roots threatening to trip them, every moment a test of endurance and cunning. Yet amid the chaos, tension between Henry and Lillian began to surface. Lillian's grip on his hand tightened, not just from fear but from an unspoken question. How far could they go? How many lines could they cross before their bond fractured under the weight of guilt and ambition? Henry sensed it, the first crack in their unity, yet neither could pause. Not while pursuit pressed so close, not while the consequences of the manor's horror loomed over every step. The creek widened into a shallow ford, and Henry guided Lillian toward the far bank. Behind them, the constables regrouped, voices calling out, lanterns swinging. Each shout, each footstep, reminded them that freedom was fleeting, that the night still held danger, and that their escape depended as much on chance as it did on skill. Beyond the trees, the faint outline of a road appeared, promising temporary refuge. Yet as they approached, Henry realized the night's terror was not just in the pursuit. The poison, the chaos, the fractures in their trust, all of it would follow them. Even if they escaped the immediate danger, the consequences of that fateful wedding night were far from over. Next we discover the shocking conclusion of their flight, the final revelation of the bridesmaids' own hidden motives and the twisted end to the night's macabre events. Chapter 13. The Final Revelation. The road ahead was faintly lit by the silver glow of the rising moon, revealing the final stretch of their flight. Henry and Lillian moved cautiously, bodies tense, every sound amplified in the night. Behind them, the faint shouts of pursuing constables were gradually fading, but the tension had not left them. Their breaths came in shallow, rapid gasps, the adrenaline of the chase mingling with the fear of what lay ahead. For hours, they had fled through forests, creeks, and overgrown paths, navigating the night with careful precision. But now, in the quiet of the open road, a new tension emerged. Lillian, whose loyalty had seemed unwavering, finally allowed a hint of her own secret to surface. Her eyes, gleaming in the moonlight, were not just filled with fear or exhilaration, they reflected a deeper ambition. "Henry," she whispered, her voice low but firm, "you did what had to be done, but we both know this isn't the end." Henry's hand tightened on hers, wary yet intrigued. Lillian had been his accomplice, but now it became clear that she had motives beyond mere survival. Her calmness, her guidance through hidden corridors, her knowledge of every contingency, it had been as much about her own plan as his. Suddenly, a carriage emerged from the shadows, a prearranged escape meticulously prepared for weeks. Henry had thought he had control, but the sight of the carriage illuminated a hidden truth. Lillian had ensured their path, yet she alone held the final key to freedom. It was a revelation that both thrilled and unsettled him. The night's macabre orchestration was complete, but it was clear that Lillian's ambitions had always been entwined with his own, in ways Henry had only partially understood. As they climbed into the carriage, Henry glanced back toward the manor. The scene he had left behind, the poisoned guests, the chaos, the dreams, would haunt him forever. Yet in that fleeting moment of reprieve, he realized that the night had revealed more than just his cunning. It had revealed human nature in its rawest form. Ambition, desire, betrayal, and the lengths one would go to claim freedom at any cost. The carriage rolled forward, the wheels crunching along the gravel road. The manor receded into darkness, the shouts of constables a distant echo, yet the memory of the night's horrors lingered, as indelible as the shadows that clung to the forest. Lillian's eyes met his, and for the first time he understood that the bond forged in secrecy and conspiracy could never be undone. They had escaped together, but neither could claim absolute control over the other. In the end, the night belonged to the audacious, the cunning, and the morally complex. The guests at the manor would awaken to chaos, authorities would investigate, and stories would ripple through the countryside. Yet Henry and Lillian had survived the immediate peril, their fates intertwined in a dark, macabre pact that would define them forever. Next, we reflect on the knight's grim legacy, the human ambition that drove such audacious acts, and the unsettling truth that sometimes the greatest horrors are hidden behind the most charming facades.